Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to be revisiting Clarkson's farm in part 2 of an Ecologist reacts to Clarkson's farm, where we revisit the series after 15 months since the first episode I uploaded. In this episode we're going to be taking a look at episode 4, 5, 6 and a tiny bit of 7 and 8. But essentially, because that video did so well the first time and they've just released roughly when season 2 will be released to the public, so it's going to be released around February 2023, and they're on about releasing it as one episode per week, which seems to really drive up the popularity of shows, particularly on Amazon Prime. They did it with The Boys and that worked really well, shall I say. So we're going to take a look at some of the ecology and wildlife practices Jeremy carries out while on his farm. So come with me and let's take a look. So our first clip comes from episode 5, Pandemicking, where during the pandemic, Jeremy Clarkson and the farm obviously have to react to no one being allowed to go anywhere and no one's allowed to work. So what's after happening is their hay bales have been set on fire by, Jeremy presumes, teenagers, and it's essentially causing a load of smoke to go across the road, which is highly dangerous, not being able to see obviously. So let's take a look at what they do. So Jeremy has Caleb come along and move the bales, essentially.
I started pushing it off the concrete, but my head feels like it's going to explode and I feel really sick because the smoke is flowing straight into the cab. It's fucking annoying. Some idiot come along and goes, "Oh, you're not being funny, you know, I'll go and start the bales over there on the lighter."
But thankfully this was just outdoors, and the only thing that was really impacted was people driving past the road, and maybe Caleb's lungs. I don't think moving the hay bales like that was wise. But yeah, I mean, it's a fun clip and I guess to show how farmers have to deal with other things and have to deal with the public coming onto their land, for example, and, you know, damaging their own property, which is a very important thing to notice as well. And you can just see here in this overview of the landscape how much that smoke is actually travelling across. And this is probably well after the fire has even been put out at this stage. It's just smouldering now at this point. And at the very end in episode 8, you actually see a farmer's field just go up in smoke. His crop goes on fire because of malfunctioning equipment. And yeah, I guess farmers and fire, it's something they have to deal with. Obviously not on a day-to-day basis, but you have to have provisions for when it does happen. So our next clip comes from episode 6, Melting, where Jeremy and the gang have to deal with the ongoing drought that happened in the summer of 2020. And in this case they use his pumpkin seeds, which he wants to grow for Halloween, and how they're not getting any water. Obviously it's the same problem with all his crops. So he decides to come down and extract water from a local stream. So yeah, here's Jeremy sucking water out of the stream, which of course could have some ecological ramifications. For example, you know, the water systems are already under a lot of pressure due to the drought, so further extracting more water than what's needed could have possible ramifications on fish and even invertebrates and everything else living in the stream. Not to mention the fact that you could be straight up sucking up the substrate, although I'm sure there's probably filters. But don't get me wrong, this happens all over the country and it's not necessarily such a bad thing. I don't disagree with it. Farmers need water. We need water to water our crops. It needs to be done. And we need water for drinking as well, which does come from rivers and streams and groundwater. This is just more of a unprofessional way of extracting it, which is necessary at the time. So he's brought it now to his pumpkin farm and he starts spreading his water. And they essentially explain to him that, yeah, you've pretty much taken 1,000 gallons from the river and you don't water more than 1.5 turns of his field, which isn't a lot, and it's a lot of water to extract if you need to be doing a lot more of it.
Where's the water gone? Gallons?
1,000 gallons.
4,500 litres. And we did 1.25 runs.
Yeah. You just put a millimetre of rain.
I have not put a millimetre on.
So he found out that essentially what he did was a lot of effort to rain a millimetre on a very small little area of land. So he comes up with another idea. So Germany has bought a solar powered water pump to essentially water the grass and the wildflowers he's planted down by his pond, which we saw in the last episode, or episode 4 even.
To try and use it. Let's just lie them down for now. That's a good idea. This should fire up the pump.
So he's going about setting up his water pump, going to take the water from the pond and then shove it up the hill and then use gravity to bring the water back down and water everything. Obviously they kind of portray it as it being, you know, rather poor and not dispersing the water quite well. But if you had it on top of the hill and used the gravity to bring it down, it would work a bit better. And they talk about having to move it every 15 minutes. But if you just use the gravity that's there, it would work a bit better, I feel. But yeah, it's probably not as powerful as they wanted. In true Jeremy fashion, comes up with a brilliant idea. Jeremy decides to buy a combustion engine, or a generator, to use the water pump. Which of course you just see is far too powerful.
That's not really working, is it?
But again, it could work if it's done right. You know, have a few hoses throughout the hill with holes punched in them and let the water come out and let nature, like gravity, do its work and gradually bring the water back down the hill. But I think, yeah, it is probably just too much power and extracting way too much water. Like, again, the problem is there's a massive drought on. It's like, what, 30 degrees or whatever like that. And your meaningful supply of water in this area of land is that pond that you've created. And now you're pumping all the water out. And it's going into a little stream nearby, which is fine. But you're washing all your seeds down with it. Which is kind of counterproductive, I'd say. So our next clip is from episode 6 again, and Jeremy has decided to plant some trees in a drought in May during weather of 30 degrees where he can't water these trees. Doesn't seem very bright, and that isn't even the problem he comes across. Sure, he finds the ground is a bit hard, but let's see what he has to say about planting these trees.
But where are all these trees going to come from? You'd have to import them from abroad, and if you do that, you get abroad diseases like ash dieback from Scandinavia and Dutch elm disease from Canada.
So you see Jeremy talking about how the UK government brought in a scheme that they're going to plant, is it 125 million trees or something in the next few years. And Jeremy talks about where the trees are going to come from and the problems of importing trees from abroad. Like ash dieback, for example, which has spread throughout the UK and Ireland and pretty much destroyed our ash trees with disease, and they have to be clear felled everywhere now to prevent it from spreading even further. So he is bang on. Like, it's a very good argument, and we do need to be planting native trees in native places, and even though they're native species, the trees themselves need to be grown in the UK and in Ireland. So Jeremy has decided that he wants to appreciate the trees while he's alive, so he's going to buy trees that are already fully grown and plant them here instead of planting these trees. So here he is after purchasing trees which he learns that are 40 years old, and now he's going to be able to enjoy them before he dies, essentially. And it kind of goes against the old saying of a society grows great when an old man plants a tree he won't enjoy the shade of. And Jeremy kind of bypasses that, as he bypasses a lot of things. One of the comments I got in the last video was, believe it or not, Jeremy does care and he does want to appreciate the environment. And I 100% agree with him. I do think he's trying to build something better. But I also think that Jeremy is using his money and his position, I guess, to enjoy something now then that other people wouldn't be able to enjoy. Which, you know, if you have the money and, like, the Amazon Prime are paying for him to do this, so he might as well reap the benefits of it now. Plus, I'm sure he actually did plant the other trees, and Jeremy does actually seem to care about the environment, even though he is a complete petrol head. And that's not to say the two of those can't go hand in hand, but, you know, people like Extinction Rebellion would. So you see here, they've had to put in pumps to irrigate the water and to aerate the roots. And it's a lovely little tree line.
20 new trees. Good for insects, good for birds, which will nest in them. I don't normally like trees, but I like these ones because they've all got exhaust pipes.
And yeah, Jeremy he loves trees with exhaust pipes because he loves exhaust pipes. But I think, you know, he said it there himself, the trees are good for birds, they're good for insects. And even though that they were 40 years old when he bought and planted them on his farm, there's still trees now on his farm that will benefit his farm and benefit the animals and the local wildlife in the farm, which is great. And it's what we're all trying to achieve, really, isn't it, at the end of the day? So one of the big things of this episode was shearing Jeremy's sheep because of the heat. Not just because of the heat, it needs to be done anyway during the summer, but the whole thing was shearing the sheep to give them extra breathing and make them more comfortable. And then he goes on to, his trees are dying and they're all losing their leaves because they're not getting enough water, so he has to come along and essentially water his trees.
Even though we were watering them constantly, they were all shedding their leaves and dying. And it was the same story everywhere. Meanwhile, down at the trout pond, Caleb, now safely back in his natural habitat, was busy protecting another source of revenue.
So he's putting up fences to keep out wildlife.
Electric fence up. We've seen a couple of dead fish on the side.
And turns out it was an otter. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So I'm putting up an electric fence around the outside of the pond where the fish are to try and stop that otter getting in.
And so we see that now that his pond is being used for wildlife, his trout, which he put in for monetary gain, are being capitalized on by the otter and herons and other animals. So he has to fence off the whole place to stop otter, and he puts up owls and other distractionary devices to keep the herons away.
Because the heron keeps coming in. That's another
Some
thing.
great footage.
Fish. So I've had to put this fence up, put the owl up to try and scare the heron away, and put a metal man up to try and deter him as well.
So yeah, Jeremy's natural pond is a bit more changed now from the natural way that it was portrayed and that when it was first being created, I guess, into this is a pond which we use to stock fish, which we're going to sell to the local pub. And now we don't want wildlife to interact with fish or take the fish even, which again, I'm not giving out. It's just funny that it started off as a wildlife project and now it's a, oh, this makes me money project. So now I have to keep the wildlife out. And Jeremy says it himself that he feels bad that he's keeping the animals away. And this next bit has nothing to do with the fish. But look how well that has greened up and look how well his watering system did work in the end. And he was just giving out about how, according to law, you have to oxygenate the fish. So there's an oxygen tank in there, so he has to keep the fish alive while he drives them to the pub to be killed. And so our final clip comes from episode 8, Harvesting. I wasn't going to include anything from this episode because, to be honest, I don't think I have anything to input on harvesting in farming that Jeremy hasn't already covered. But I did mention how in this episode another farmer's field went on fire. So I thought it'd be cool to show that. Well, not cool, but important to show that since I referenced it. So yeah, they've just noticed that the neighbouring field has gone on fire, and here we see the overview of it.
Every farmer's nightmare. A harvest blaze caused by malfunctioning equipment.
I'm on it now, just bear with me 2 minutes.
It's pretty tragic, you know, like you spend your whole year waiting for this to harvest and you have to wait for it to be dry enough, but of course, because it's so dry when you harvest it, a spark can nearly set it on flames, on fire. So if there's anything malfunctioning or anything in your equipment, you could have a massive fire like this. And there are some amazing videos from, I think, is it Australia? I'll try to include it here while I'm talking, where the harvesters have to like essentially go around and plow up the ground to stop the fire from spreading to other parts of their field, which is just insane to think that, you know, you wait, what, 6 months 8 months for your harvest to grow, and then it finally comes to the time to cut it, and it just goes up in flames like that, and your whole year and maybe even your whole livelihood could be jeopardized because of a fire. It's insane to think about, really. And so that brings us to the end of An Ecologist Reacts to Clarkson's Farm Part 2. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. I really enjoyed making this video and giving my insight again on some of the practices Jeremy Clarkson carried out, and whether or not they were good is questionable and up for you to decide, really. But yeah, I thought it'd be really cool to make this video, especially with Season 2 being released in, I think, February. Then yeah, it gives me the opportunity to, I can maybe do one of these reaction videos to every episode. We'll see how it comes out, if they do the same sort of format or if they just break it up again. But yeah, I guess we'll see how it comes along. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll catch you all next time.